Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Pinpoint Savings Targets with Accuracy, Benchmarking Purchase Services. Today, we are excited to get started as we have some great content to share. Please feel free to use the chat feature throughout the presentation. And if time allows at the end, we will address any questions that come up. Let me start first with introductions. My name is Nicole, and I am our head of customer success and engagement, and I am your host for today's event. We are so lucky to be joined by two experts from Conductive's operation team, Anna Ormiston, the head of GPO and operations, and Kyla Ritchie, the manager of data products. They will both be sharing their benchmarking expertise with you through our time together. So with that, let's get started with our exciting content. Today, you may ask yourself, what do all of these logos have in common? Benchmarks are everywhere in our everyday lives. Whether you are car shopping, looking for a service, comparing products, planning a trip, we all shop around and make sure that we're getting the most for our consumer dollars. And as consumerism and consumer awareness becomes more rampant, we even have databases available to assist us with shopping for our medical care and to make informed decisions. As we delve into this topic specifically related to purchase services, we hope that you will remember some key takeaways from today's learning session. One, why is purchase services benchmarking different or unique? Two, what are some of the best practices that you need to be aware of for pricing and SLA comparisons? And three, how do you use this data to engage and leverage discussions with suppliers and stakeholders? Keeping these objectives in mind, I'm going to turn this part of the discussion over to Kyler, who will address the often aloof question, what are purchase services?
Thank you, Nicole. So let's define purchase services if we're going to do a deep dive into how you benchmark this space. There seems to be a lack of definition in the industry when it comes to this topic. If you ask five health systems, you're going to get five different answers as to how they define purchase services and maybe what their initiatives are. Um, and we have a broad definition at Conductive that anything that the organization outsources to an outside supplier is a purchase service. So you'll see on this list some common stakeholder groups and services that they might manage. And some of these common categories that we see, but it's certainly not a comprehensive list. We have over 615 categories that we have expertise in within purchase services. So let's talk about some of the use cases for benchmarking purchase services. The first use case, I think, and certainly one of the most beneficial, is the ability to create a roadmap of actionable opportunities. Now, this requires a proactive approach, identifying impending expirations and getting benchmarks well in advance of any impending renewals. And you're not looking at one category, right? If you're going to use benchmarks to create a roadmap, you're going to leverage your AP spend and your expiration reports to look at a number of categories. Now, the second use case is going to be using benchmark reports to unite your stakeholders to the supply chain cause. We know lack of stakeholder buy-in is a big issue, and you'll get pushback if stakeholders don't feel included. So benchmarks are one way to rally the troops and get stakeholders involved. Another use case is probably the most obvious and well-known benefit of benchmarking. You want to be able to lower your costs. And I think whenever you say the word benchmark, that's exactly what people initially think of. But we at Conductive stress that benchmarking purchase services should go beyond costs. And that's where we look at contract terms. For example, termination language in bulk gas contracts are not a given just because there's a huge upfront investment from suppliers that can't recoup their investment until maybe the first 3 or 4 years of the agreement. So termination without cause in a bulk gas agreement may not be a given. So benchmarking your contract terms will give you more insights into what language is appropriate. This terms review should go beyond basic contract terms to evaluate your scope of work. For example, environmental services scope of works can be maybe a dozen pages long. And so your benchmarking provider should be able to provide insights into how best to structure your scope of work in your agreements. And then lastly, of course, KPIs are another area where benchmarks should be providing feedback. Those KPIs should be unique to the category and are going to really help you bring value to your contract and hold your supplier to the service levels that you agreed to. And so if you put all of those benchmarking use cases together, that should help create sourcing efficiencies, right? So if you do a benchmark and you know that you have great value and great terms and great pricing in your contracts, you can just check that box and move on. Or you may identify that you have a lot of room to improve. Maybe that's something that you want to put time and resources into a full RFP rather than quickly renewing the agreement.
Thank you so much for this additional groundwork. Now, Anna, can you spend a few minutes talking us through what makes purchase services so difficult to benchmark?
Yeah, absolutely. So, supply chain really has only recently started looking at purchase services. They historically have been focused on labor and supplies. And why is that? Those costs are usually contained within supply chain, both contracting and cost monitoring. As Kyler showed on one of the previous slides with all the different categories, one of the first things that you're going to see in purchase services is that it's actually really difficult to even find the owner of the service. Those categories touch so many different stakeholders that you may not even know who to go talk to. And if these stakeholders happen to be writing their own agreements, let's say, for example, HR, they may have written their own background screening services contract if they did it on their own. And that likely means that it never went through supply chain. So if you don't know about it, you don't even know what the terms are that you are agreeing to in there. And there may be issues with that. If you have certain language that your health system requires in every contract, the HR team may have not even been aware that they needed to put it in there. So the first step a lot of people are going to turn to is data. And so you may look at PO, you're going to quickly find that a lot of services aren't hitting your PO. So you're going to switch over to looking at your AP file. Well, that is thousands upon thousands of line items if it's not categorized. So if you don't even know who your background screening suppliers might be, how are you ever going to find it in there? But, let's say best case scenario, you actually know you have a contract and you know who the suppliers are and what the spend is. How are you going to source that moving forward? With products, you may be able to turn to a GPO to get something quickly in place, but services, you're likely going to have to do that at the local level, which means you're going to have to find staff and time to do this. Diving into a little bit more about what makes it so different than products, products have this really great thing called a SKU, and that SKU is going to tell you what the product is and even who manufactures it. And in a lot of cases, you're even going to have cross reference information for competitive suppliers about what products they have that are comparable. How do you even do that with services like for quality? You can get your stakeholders together in a room and they can touch and feel a product and they can even pass it around. You probably even have a value analysis committee, right? That's going to tell you maybe even the clinical impact of that product. For services, it's really subjective. Hospital A could be in love with their waste services provider. They think they're reliable, they think they have great service, while Hospital B down the street using the exact same supplier hates them. And it's because they have different definitions of quality and different definitions and requirements of their contract. So it's not really comparable. And I know I touched on this a little bit earlier for products, but you're going to have a slew of GPO contracts that you're likely just going to be able to buy off of. For services, it's light, ready, quote unquote, ready to activate coverage in the national GPO space, which makes it really hard. So all of these contracts and services are really customized at the local level. And because of that, you're going to have to put a lot of time and effort into those, into developing separate SOWs, even within your own health system per site. So let's say, one of your hospitals, they need landscaping services, and one site needs their trees trimmed maybe twice a year for anything under 20 feet. But another site says, no, 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 I need my trees trimmed 4 times a year for anything under 25. So all of this together kind of justifies why you have to handle services differently.
Now that Anna's provided an overview of why purchase services are different from a benchmarking perspective, which, by the way, thank you, Anna, for these insights. Kyler, can you help the group understand why having an understanding of your benchmarking company's methodology is important? Like, why should customers or supply chain representatives actually care?
Sure, Nicole. And we'll start off on this topic by talking about why looking outside your network is important in driving maximum value. And for this example, we're going to use medical coding. This service is usually provided remotely, so regionality isn't a huge consideration when looking at the data. And when comparisons are made with GPO data, you'll see that the data has very little variance. As you'll see here, we've got a lot of data points in the $60 range with just a few organizations that negotiated their rate beyond the GPO rates shown here. But when you expand the data set outside of the GPO relationship, we see very little pricing discipline from the suppliers, a lot of room for negotiation, and very substantial savings that exceed the GPO's reach. Let's dig a little bit deeper into the methodology behind purchase services benchmarking and the category dynamics that affect the benchmark, such as the location that affects the pricing or the provision of the service. Another variable is the competitive landscape for the category. Local competition can be different for services that are provided on site, such as lithotripsy. But in the previous example, medical coding, you're not going to see a local competitive landscape that differs much from the national landscape. And adding on to that, are your sites consolidated or do you have multiple hospitals using different vendors? Annual spend is another factor that can greatly impact pricing and should be factored into your rates. We talked about this a little bit earlier, leveraging spend to drive cost savings. And all of these factors are used to compile benchmarking recommendations. And now that we've talked about some of these parametric factors at a high level, let's talk about how they're applied to a specific category. And for this example, we're going to use waste management services. This category is one of my favorite categories to benchmark just because there's different factors that affect pricing and terms. And it's a really unique and customized benchmark every single time. Now, within waste management services, you're going to have different waste streams, for example, pharmaceutical waste or regulated medical waste. And within those different waste streams, we've got multiple different pricing methodologies. So maybe per ton or per pound, depending on the waste stream. And if you're looking at regulated medical waste, that may be per pound or per container, this all adds to the complexity of the category. And if your supplier is sophisticated, like many are, they can use this to their advantage. For example, we've seen recently when we're talking about supplier pricing strategies is they'll try to bundle pricing together into a monthly fee. So for example, they'll cover regulated medical waste for a flat fee of $5,000 per month. Now, this pricing methodology makes it incredibly difficult to understand the value you're getting because the utilization at that facility may be fluctuating month to month. Your benchmarking provider should be helping to provide clarity in these scenarios and provide guidance here. So when we talk about benchmarking flat rates against other organizations, utilization is key to benchmarking those flat rates. Certain categories, utilization needs to be taken into account more when benchmarking, but it's certainly key to providing an accurate benchmark in waste management. Now, another impact here is the regulatory environment. Now, the state of California has unique EPA regulations that impact pricing, but one state you may not think of that has regulatory issues that impacts pricing is Utah. Recently, the state of Utah has put down pretty hefty fines against one supplier in the state, which caused them to actually close one of their plants. And the result of this is that the hospital has to ship their waste across multiple state lines, hundreds of miles, which results in a higher rate that they have to pay. And so when you get a benchmark back from your benchmarking provider, these are all the factors that really should be factored into the benchmark. It's not just a simple rate compared to other contracts rates.
That's really great information. Now we can really see how having a detailed understanding of the methodology and parametric factors can impact the benchmark report. So, Anna, what are the most valuable components within the benchmark report? And is the primary purpose just to evaluate pricing?
That's going to be the first thing that people look at, right? Is can I save money? But I really caution everyone not to look at pricing or savings just from a total contract value, but actually look at your individual service line items within that contract to see what savings you can achieve. So, you can go to your supplier and say, give me 10% savings. But if you look at a detailed benchmark that has rates by service line item with your utilization coupled in there, you may find that on a high utilized item, you could say 20%. And so instead of just going to ask for this generic 10%, which may not provide as much impact, maybe you need to focus on that one line item that shows you 20% and spend your time there. But once you have those rates, it's really important to understand the variables that were considered to get your benchmark rates in the first place. One of the main drivers we've talked about already today in purchase services for pricing is geography, but that's not every category. We went over medical coding earlier that if it's offsite, I don't expect a hospital in Arizona to pay a different price than a hospital in Florida. It doesn't matter where in the country, or maybe depending on your hospital's rules, maybe where in the world that coder is. The rate should stay the same. Tyler, are there any other services you think of that geography does really impact it?
Yeah, I think one category where geography really affects the rate is dialysis services. A huge cost driver for this service is nursing labor. So comparing rates from California to, say, New Mexico may not be an applicable benchmark here. These rates need to be adjusted based on the state that the services are being provided.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we talk about this because if you try and negotiate your benchmark rates, one of the first things that supplier may try and do is attack the data set behind it. They may say, I can't give you that price. That's an old price. Where you are in the country, you have to purchase it differently and we have to charge you differently. We're actually even dealing with this with a current customer right now up in the Northeast, who we did a blood benchmark for. What's interesting is a lot of hospitals across the US think that where you are matters when you purchase through a blood supplier. And, we've seen hundreds of data points, and honestly, there is little to no impact based on geography for your price of red blood cells. And so we did this benchmark for them, and they went to the supplier, and the first thing the supplier said was, I can't give you that price because you're in the Northeast. I have to give you a different price. Like the data set that you're using is not right to compare me against. And so we help them craft a message back to the supplier, talking through here's all the data set points that were used. Go back to them and say, listen, supplier, we want to do business with you. We're trying to be a good partner, but now I have a benchmark report in my hand that shows I'm not buying a market competitive price from you. And my leadership is going to ask, why am I doing that? So, supplier, help us continue to work together to get something that is fair and reasonable for both parties so we don't have to go to RFP. We focus a lot on price naturally in benchmarks because that's what people want to see. But I can't tell you the amount of value you're going to leave off the table if you don't look at key performance indicators or KPIs. A lot of contracts that I look at, they just don't have KPIs in purchase services today. It's still something that people are just slowly beginning to write into their agreements. And when I talk to hospitals and I say, hey, did you think about writing this? Was this ever discussed? A lot of the times, what I hear back is they say no, but I have termination for convenience. And so I can get out of this contract if my service levels are bad, which is great. I always want to have termination for convenience in your contract. But if you stop and think about it for a second, how hard was it to get that contract in place the first time around? You had to get all your stakeholders together. You had to get stakeholders from several different sites, and that took forever, honestly, just even to schedule that kickoff meeting, right? And then you had to get them all to agree on the key performance indicators and service levels and what is good quality and price. And then, you put it through your legal, which sometimes takes forever. You don't really want your only remedy to be terminating the contract. So you should put that on your benchmarking partner. Tell me what quality indicators should I be monitoring and what penalties should I be putting in there for the supplier. So that way, through the life of the agreement, you're really just encouraging supplier to provide a high level of service versus just that one penalty of we're just going to have to walk away if things aren't going well. When you look at KPIs, though, there are other ways that you can write them into your agreement outside of just, in that last example with, waste. You need to make sure they're delivering waste on time, on the designated days, and maybe in a certain hour time block. Another thing you can look at is writing KPIs into your contract for cost monitoring. So a lot of purchase services, the cost is not going to be the same every month. If we want to look at maybe food and nutrition management services as an example, So your contracts there are likely going to be structured with a per patient day rate and then a variable rate. And that's based on usually like the past 12 months of patient census when you were negotiating the contract to get those two rates together. So that means in any given month, just your total bill from those two line items alone is going to vary based on your patient census. And that's not even taking into consideration those costs that are really variable, such as maybe like floor stocks or catering. So you don't want to find out at the end of the month that there was a staff meeting, perhaps where catering was ordered and they got, steak and lobster. I mean, that's going to be a huge bill. You want to put that on your supplier partner to set thresholds and to help monitor those fluctuating costs to let you know if something doesn't look right and let you know maybe if that person who ordered catering wasn't authorized for catering. So ask them to do that. And then lastly, when you're thinking about those clinical categories, then that brings KPIs to a whole other level. Joint Commission is expecting you to write quality indicators in your contracts and that you're regularly monitoring them. Food nutrition, obviously that touches the patient. But when you think about something like lithotripsy, if you have service issues with your provider, we're talking not only potential harm to a patient, but to your system as well. Maybe even worrying about losing your certification via Joint Commission.
Now we understand what the key components are in the data that you should be looking for, which are beyond price, to ensure that you get the best contract for your organization. So let's take a look at how leveraging benchmarks will give you optimal results. First, let me say the best way to leverage benchmarks is simply to request them and use them. The benchmark should be used for incumbent negotiations as well as for creating RFP events to drive competition and change. A case example that I wanted to review with you today is transcription. We were working with a customer who leveraged a benchmark report on transcription to get a base understanding of the fees and the service level agreements that they should obtain for a new award. Armed with this knowledge, the customer decided to use the live negotiation platform post RFP in order to drive results. As you will notice on this slide, the full live negotiation event took 120 minutes beginning to end, and this created efficiencies for the strategic sourcing team. Their incumbent supplier at the top, also in red, was the highest priced provider leading into this event. Each change mark with a pencil is a point in time in which the vendor adjusted their key terms and conditions. And each change marked with a dollar sign is where the vendors adjusted their pricing. All of this was based on customer feedback that was provided from the benchmark report. Through the use of this platform and as time went on, you will note that the incumbent realized that they were not in the lead and that they drastically dropped their pricing near the end of the event to try and secure the business. Many organizations might look at the price and say, wow, they really want to work with us. It would be easy to stay with them because there's no cost to conversion. However, other organizations would look at the same results and say, wow, they've really been hosing us the past X number of years, and we've been doing business with them. What kind of partner are they really? Even still, other organizations may say, let's take the absolute lowest cost provider. I'm here to tell you that that is not a recommended approach. And I would tend to agree with the sentiments of the organization who did not feel like their vendor had been a partner. In addition to taking that lowest cost provider, it may come at a cost of value and at a cost of quality of service. So it's important to weigh the full package here. What is the best service I can obtain within my personal requirements at the lowest cost for that service level? Looking at total cost of ownership, this particular hospital did end up deciding to move away from their incumbent. And I think they made the right choice. However, they selected the second vendor from the bottom, giving them a win-win. They negotiated the best service for the best price for the service levels that they needed to run their organization. And as Anna mentioned earlier, price isn't the only key factor when it comes to services. We've seen some great things come out of leveraging benchmarks. Anna, can you review some of the different ways that customers have utilized benchmarks to impact their organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. What I'm showing on the screen here is a great story. So we were working with a customer in California, and they were looking at their waste management services. Waste is apparently our favorite category today. They had talked internally and they weren't that interested in going out to bid. They kind of wanted to stay with their current incumbent. So they just went to the current supplier and said, "Hey, what can you do for me here?" And the supplier came back with $400,000 in savings. And I don't know about you guys, but I think a lot of people would have taken that money and ran, right? If you're being monitored on how much savings that you can provide to the organization, you may just want to take that savings, check that box, and then move on to something else. But to Nicole's point, they kind of thought, well, wait, if you're my current supplier and you've been giving me business all these years, am I not getting the best price? And so they requested a benchmark and they sent over contracts and utilization and we ran the report. And what we found was it actually looked like there was probably $800,000 in opportunity here. And so now the health system is thinking, wait, maybe I really have been getting worked over all these years. So instead of just renegotiating with them at that point, I think we need to take this out to bid. So they ran a full RFP process going into it with their benchmarking report. So they knew the rates they wanted to pay. They knew the terms they could get. They knew the KPIs they wished to write into their contract. They ran the RFP and then even put a live negotiation on the back end of the process, and it resulted in 1.2 million in savings without having to change suppliers. So that just goes to show, what having solid benchmarking information can give you before going into your sourcing event. Um, some of the other things that we have seen from other health system recently we worked with was someone who got 13% savings in translation and interpretation. I bring this one up because this category is really regularly ripe with savings. So if you aren't looking at it, I mean, another one I highly recommend you consider is laundry and linen services. We worked with another hospital that was putting this service out to bid. They were actually facing a 30% increase with their incumbent. And so their incumbent wanted to actually build a new distribution plant, and they were essentially passing the cost on to the customer in the terms of that per pound rate. But again, through the benchmark, we were able to achieve a 10% savings and KPI improvements. We saw a quick win for a hospital in Texas. They got 50,000 in savings for medical coding. And you can do these benchmarks one off, and I'm telling you, over time, the savings really adds up. So we worked with a coalition in the South. I think it had maybe 35 million savings over the past decade. And then another system that we've been working with for years, they've gotten up to 82 million in savings, which was 20 times the ROI. So I really recommend this is something that you build on over time because these dollars are going to add up and they're going to hit your bottom line directly.
Wow, those are all really great examples. Kyler and Anna, thank you both so much for your valuable information that you have shared today. To end our session, I want to recap some of our key objectives. I trust that you're walking away feeling more informed about purchase services and benchmarking. You should now know why a different approach is needed for benchmarking purchase services, how variations in parametric factors have to be considered, and how understanding the methodology is important, why transactional data is the best data, and the importance of looking beyond your GPO for benchmarks, and how benchmarks allow you to gain better transparency in pricing, improve terms, stakeholder engagement when leveraged appropriately. We did receive a few questions through the chat feature, and unfortunately, we are out of time today. So we will address these questions through a Q&A document offline. But I'd like to thank everyone for their participation. And again, thank you so much to both Anna and Kyler for your key insights. If you'd like to learn how Conductive helps hospitals optimize their contracting potential through benchmarking, feel free to reach out to us. To see our purchase services solution, visit us online at conductive.com and request a demo. Have a great day, everyone.